This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. We start today's show with a two-part conversation on carbon credits with post-doctoral fellow in the Agricultural Economics Department here at K-State, Micah Cameron Harp. Our first segment begins with the basics of what a carbon credit is, how they are utilized, and what it looks like to take advantage of the carbon market as an agricultural producer today. In part two, Micah shares insight on how credits are generated and the different factors that can impact producer return on investment in these programs. It's a newer market for agriculture, and there's still so much to learn. Also ahead, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk encourages producers to start planning now for how they want to celebrate National Dairy Month in June in this week's Milk Lines. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by Micah Cameron Harp. He's a postdoctoral fellow in agricultural economics here at K-State, and he's joining us today to talk about carbon credits, which is a market fairly new to agriculture in the world that we talk about fairly often on this show. So, Micah, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's very great to be here, and I'm very excited to talk about this topic.
Absolutely. Like I said, a hot button topic for a lot of us involved in the industry. And I think there's just really a lot of unknowns still for a lot of people that are interested in this sort of market. So let's start with the basics. What really are carbon credits?
So a carbon credit at its core is an asset which says at some place and at some point in time, some carbon was sequestered in the soil, right? And so if I am somebody, I will go out and I purchase some carbon credits. What that says is I now own the rights to that carbon in the soil. For the use of carbon credits and why a market developed, right, is that there are some industries where it's very costly for them to reduce the amount of carbon they're emitting into the atmosphere. So instead, what they're willing to do is compensate somebody else for sequestering it elsewhere. And that's called an offset, and that's kind of the basis of these carbon credit markets.
Sure. So this has existed in other industries, but like we said, it's kind of new to agriculture. So compared to other industries, what does that really look like compared to ag?
Yeah, so one of the statistics that I like to use for reference is Microsoft contracted for, I believe, 1.3 million metric tons of carbon offsets in 2021. Of those 1.3 million, 200,000 were from agriculture. So it's a portion of the portfolio of carbon credits. Historically, a lot of them have been from the forestry sector. There's been some recent analyses of those which suggest that perhaps agricultural carbon credits may have some advantages as far as the quality of the credits that are produced. So I think going forward, in terms of the mix, we're going to see a greater prevalence of agricultural carbon credits.
Sure. So a lot of these are major companies such as Microsoft that are, having these big target goals. By the end of 2050, we're going to have carbon neutral, those sort of things, right?
Exactly, yeah. And that's a very important thing to keep in mind when you think about the structure of this market, is that the demand side of it is purely driven by corporate social responsibility actions, right? So companies, Microsoft, PepsiCo, large organizations that have made these commitments to being carbon neutral, and they're being held to those by their shareholders. So this is not a market which is driven by regulatory actions or compliance, and that means that it's exposed to a couple more sources of volatility. We may have a change in demand depending on how strictly the companies decide they're going to adhere to those commitments.
Sure. So a very unique market to be in. And really, you just mentioned what drives those markets today, and that's kind of the social aspect of some of these bigger corporations, right?
Yeah. So in recent years, there's been a growing push for companies to internalize some of the externalities, what we call them in economics, but these are these unaccounted for costs that happen during their supply chain. So let's say Microsoft, I buy a computer from them, I'm purchasing the computer, but in the production of that computer, they've also been emitting some greenhouse gases, right? Previously, we haven't really been accounting for them, so it's a cost that I am bearing and that potentially other people are bearing too, due to its effects on the climate. Now, these offset markets and carbon credits are a way to internalize those costs.
Sure. So obviously there's some company benefits here, major corporation benefits, but what are the producer benefits in this situation?
So the benefit right now for participation that I would say is going to be additional to those that potentially occur from agronomic benefits from adopting some of these practices is going to be financial compensation or ownership of the carbon rights. So one of the things that I always like to tell people when they think about the carbon market is it isn't like a normal asset market or a commodity market. So commodity market, wheat, right, is wheat is wheat. Number 2, yellow corn, right? It's the same commodity everywhere you go. That is not the case with carbon credits. Instead, it's like you're going in, you're shopping for a smartphone, right? There's multiple different types of smartphones. Which one's best? Kind of depends. Carbon credits, similarly in the agriculture space, we have 10 different companies that producers can work with. They're producing 10 different types of carbon credits. So when we ask certain questions, the answer, like many good economic questions, is it depends.
Sure, that's a common phrase we hear in extension with a lot of the discussions that we have, is it really does depend. And this is one of those situations where that's very applicable, of course. So when it comes to understanding enrolling in these programs, what should the producer really know?
That is a fantastic question. And there are a couple main questions that I would encourage producers to think about. One of them from the beginning is, do I want to sign up for a program where I'm going to be rewarded based on the carbon sequestration, which the intermediary, these are the companies like Indigo or Nori that they'll be working with, that the intermediary is modeling is going to occur on my land? Or am I going to be rewarded for just adopting a practice? So these are two types of programs. We call the first a payment for sequestration program, right, because I'm getting paid for actually what's occurring in the soil. The second, payment for practice. So I'm going to get paid for, let's say, cover cropping on a per acre per year basis, regardless of what happens below the soil. I say that because if you look across Kansas, the rate of expected sequestration is going to vary a lot for these different practices. So cover cropping, for instance. More rain in eastern Kansas is going to be greater biomass, which is going to translate to more carbon being sequestered in the soil. Go to a drier climate, probably going to get much lower carbon sequestration. So if you sign up for a payment for sequestration program, in East Kansas, the expected return on that is going to be much higher than in West Kansas. Whereas a payment for practice program, payment would be exactly the same.
Sure. So just doing the practice, not actually having the reported outcome per se in those situations.
Yeah. And the reason that there are these differences between these programs is because, like the iPhone example, they're different quality goods that end up being produced. The way that we measure the quality or think about it are really 4 main issues. The first is additionality. The second is uncertainty. Third is leakage. And then the fourth is going to be permanence. So additionality is really the concern that if I'm purchasing a carbon credit, I want to purchase one which is based on an action that wouldn't have occurred without that incentive. So if I'm going to be buying a carbon credit based on the actions of a producer in Kansas, let's say it's based on cover cropping, and that producer was going to cover crop anyways, then that carbon really isn't additional, right? So that's this additionality aspect. I'll talk about permanence real quick. It's just the concern that carbon is an inherently organic substance, right? It's based off biomass. And so over time, it's going to break down in the soil to a certain extent. I like to compare it to gold because it isn't like gold, to clarify. If you bury a chunk of gold in your backyard and you dig it up 10 years later, the mass of gold is almost identical, right? Be a tiny bit lost from weathering. If I bury carbon in your backyard for 10 years and dig it back up, it's going to have broken down into many different types of carbon, right? And perhaps some of it's going to decompose. So the question of permanence is really a question of how long that carbon's going to stick around. So if I'm really concerned about it and I want to buy carbon credits which have great permanence, I'm going to be really specific about where that carbon is sequestered, right, and how long I'm going to expect it to stick around. Leakage is more of a global issue. So one of the concerns is that, let's say I have a program where I encourage producers to take cropland and turn it into forest here in the United States. And the global market, that might then, if demand stays constant, encourage supply to grow and expand in another region, let's say South America. Because that incentive exists, somebody might decide to go out, log a portion of the Amazonian rainforest, plant soybeans. The amount of carbon that gets emitted from logging the Amazonian rainforest relative to the amount which we sequestered by changing a little bit of cropland to forest land in North America can be much larger. So we end up losing more carbon from the soil than we actually gained. So that's this question of leakage, and it's one of the reasons why we see a lot of the programs focusing on adoption of practices like cover cropping, reductions in tillage, changes to the nitrogen management are a big one as well, rather than thinking about conversion of land use. And then finally, uncertainty. This is the one that I always get to pick on my agronomist and soil scientist friends about. There's an inherent difficulty in predicting the dynamics of soil carbon over time at a fine resolution, right? So any producer who walks across their field knows that the soil type probably changes if you take 20 steps away from someplace at times. That means that the predictions, right, and the uncertainty there when we're trying to make these large estimates at field or state levels is going to be pretty wide. And so narrowing those uncertainty bounds definitely improves the quality of the credit.
We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll continue our conversation on carbon credits ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today. We're continuing our conversation now on carbon credits with K-State postdoctoral fellow in agricultural economics, Micah Cameron Harp. Micah continues the conversation by sharing insight on how credits are generated and the different factors that can actually impact producers' return on investment in these programs. Once again, we're continuing that conversation on carbon credits now. So those are things that companies are keeping in mind when they're looking to, say, partner with a producer in some of these programs.
Yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of these issues are going to be built into how, let's say, Indigo compensates producers who participate. So Indigo actually, in order to generate the credits, has a set of standards that are set internationally, and they adhere to them. They get them approved by that agency. So one of those crediting groups is VERRA, VERRA. And so they look at what Indigo's program looks like, and they say, yes, this fulfills the criteria. Then Indigo is able to say, all right, based on what these producers are doing, we've generated 100 credits, whatever the number may be. So then Microsoft, let's say, for instance, when they're shopping for Indigo, Cargill, Corteva, they can look at the standards that were used, and those qualities we just mentioned are going to determine, how they figure out which one is of the quality they desire.
Okay, that makes sense for sure. And, we've mentioned that this is something that shouldn't just be jumped into, kind of. There's a lot of considerations that come to mind when producers are thinking about enrolling in these types of programs and really understanding the return on investment in some of these different aspects.
Exactly. So I mentioned before the difference between payment for sequestration and payment for practice plants. If I'm a producer and I'm considering which program, the other thing I always encourage people to think about is the time that's involved. So if I'm going to join a payment for sequestration plan, usually they want between 3 and 10 years of farm management data at the field level. So everything from when I'm planting, what I'm planting, to when I'm harvesting, how much nitrogen I'm applying, and how. For every field I want to enroll. I talked to a producer, Solomon, Kansas. He said he enrolled 6 fields and it took him 100 man-hours to do it. So not inconsequential amount of time, and that is definitely a consideration to keep in mind. So that would fall under the category of what we call transaction costs, right? My time spent getting involved in the program, it's always going to be a loss in the transaction cost category. There's another element to the cost-benefit calculation, which is kind of both the pros and cons of how that changes my management itself. So let's say no-till, for example. If I look at what the potential total net return is, right, I'm going to have my payment dollars per unit of tons sequestered times how many tons I'm expected to sequester in that field, minus my transaction cost, the time it took me to enter everything into the website. But then there's also going to be potential agronomic benefits, right? So maybe it changes the soil moisture dynamics. And then additional considerations like savings in fuel. So I'm making less passes on the field. So I would say that, yes, it's exciting to look at just what is my potential payment per acre from enrolling. But these other considerations ultimately, and producers are well aware of them, are going to be some of the main determinants of whether it's worthwhile to participate.
Sure. And one that we discussed a little bit before we went on air here was kind of the exchanging of data in this situation, which as our age grows more and more digital and data becomes more and more of an important resource, I feel like, in today, that's something to consider too, right? Yeah.
So I think when you're looking at these different programs, and I would encourage you to go, my website is M as in Micah Cameron Harp.com. I have some slides there and some resources you can look at these different programs. If you look at some of these descriptions and how the data can be used, some of them are much stricter than others. So some will say the data can only be used for the purposes of calculating how much carbon is expected to be sequestered. Others say that they can use the data and share it with groups that they have a financial interest in, which is fairly broad language, right? Some of the companies that are involved in this market are also some of the largest input suppliers, right? So we have Corteva, Cargill, Truterra, major companies that if we're sharing this information with them, they now have very fine scale information on what inputs are being applied, when they're being applied, and the seed that's being bought, right? So this is all things that the input supplier can use to really inform their sales, right, and pricing. So I'd encourage folks to think about carefully, how that data is going to be shared and make sure that whoever they're working with is very transparent about how it's going to be used. The other component that's kind of similar there is to spend some time thinking about the specific way in which they're going to be compensated. Some programs are going to do it on a cash basis. It's going to be a check in the mail every year. Others are going to end up giving the carbon credits to the producer as compensation. So I'll use a specific example. There's a program by Truterra where they'll pay, I think it's $2 per acre per year if you participate in their program, you adopt one of the covered practices, and then at the end of it, the producer owns the carbon credit as an asset. Carbon credits are kind of a risky asset. There's going to be a global market that is going to shift this price around. This asset that they are holding on to, right, is one that what we've seen currently is that the price is trending upwards. So I'll use the example of indigo. 2 years ago, when I was looking at indigo's credits, they were selling for about $20 a credit. Now it's around $40. And they have built into their program, if you work with indigo, the producer ends up getting 75% of what indigo sells it to. So if they sell it to Microsoft for $40 credit, they're going to give me $30 per credit I generate. That's a pretty big change in price, though. And so if instead I was in a different program like this one by Truterra I mentioned, and I'm the one holding on to that asset, the carbon credit, I've now added a fairly risky asset to my portfolio. So some people may be very interested in that. That might be exactly what they want, and they may think that the price of carbon credits is going to continue to trend upwards, which is what I think is going to happen as well. But that's an important consideration, right? Do you want to expose yourself to that additional source of risk, or instead do you want to say, I'm going to rely on some payment structure where the intermediary, Indigo, Trudera, sells it and then gives me the check in the mail, as it were.
Sure, a whole new avenue to learn and understand as well, I'm sure. I mean, there is some knowledge that has to go into using another corporation to sell those carbon credits, but even more so if you yourself were trying to do it as well on top of that.
Yeah, and the assets in most cases are going to only be sold within that group's platform. So I mentioned before, this is a diversified product market, is what we call it in econ speak, as it were. So if I own Trudera carbon credits, they're usually going to have a Trudera platform for me to sell those on. So this isn't going to be something where I can work with Agoro, for instance, get some Agoro credits and then go and sell them right outside of that marketplace, as it were.
Okay, that makes sense. And when you were speaking earlier, you mentioned that there are kind of 10 current programs available in Kansas, and you also mentioned your website. So if producers are kind of interested in learning more about each of these individual programs, is your website a great place to do that?
Yeah, and there's a link there. There's a great material that I linked to from Iowa State Extension where they actually have this very detailed spreadsheet where they outline a variety of characteristics. In my slides at my website, you can find just the list of the 10 within Kansas and some kind of preliminary questions. Am I using a crop that is eligible for one of these? Have I adopted a new practice recently enough in order to be eligible? And then what the data requirements are, and finally how you'd be compensated. So those are kind of the main questions that I've included in mine. If you want a much more detailed explanation, I would encourage you to go look at those materials. And again, the links to both are up on my website.
Absolutely. Well, I'll be sure to link to all of that as well in our show notes, which can be found on agtoday.net on our podcast website. So be sure to check that out if you're interested in learning more. But Micah, we didn't even get into the future of carbon credits. I think we'll have to save that for another time because this conversation's been great, but there's still so much more to understand about this market.
Yeah, and that's what makes it a really fun topic for me to continue to do research on, and something that I think continues to be a source of very exciting discussions and debates.
Absolutely. Well, I think listeners will glean a lot from this segment that we've recorded today, so I can't thank you enough for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was Micah Cameron Harp. He is a post-doctoral fellow in agricultural economics here at K-State, joining us for a conversation on carbon credits. Still to come on Agriculture Today, this week's Milk Lines with K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk. This week, he encourages producers to start planning now for how they want to celebrate National Dairy Month this summer in June. We'll be back with that when we return on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's Milk Lines. National Dairy Month isn't until June. However, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk encourages dairy farmers to start thinking now about how they want to promote their dairy and the dairy industry.
Today, I want to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning some upcoming events as we look forward into 2023. One of the things that you probably should start thinking about is June is Dairy Month. It's a time when we celebrate our industry and we share our industry with those in our community, our families, and those that we have contact with. It's really a special time of celebration. It really takes some planning if you do it right. So, what are you considering to do for June is Dairy Month this year? Have you started making any plans? I would encourage you to start that now. You might want to think about just hosting a small event on your dairy. Maybe you invite the local radio station to come out and to broadcast for maybe an hour or so one morning on your dairy. During that time, you could get with some of your suppliers, those that supply feed and other supplies to your dairy, and see if they would help sponsor maybe some donuts and coffee or some sort of light snack so people that are coming out to visit can enjoy while they visit your dairy. Now, what about those folks coming to the dairy? What message do you want to share with them? It's important to really think about that. You know, we have some really great resources that you can access through our promotion groups around the state and also in the region. I would encourage you to talk with maybe the Kansas Dairy Association about some things that they might provide to your farm. It's a part of your membership as you sell milk each month, and that includes the Kansas Dairy Commission. Also, the Midwest Dairy has many types of information that they can provide. These things are things that you can talk about, but they're also things for people to do, like special coloring books that have something to do with the dairy industry. This is great for young children that might be coming to your dairy. Now, as you think about the people coming to the dairy, you need to think about what kind of activities that you want to provide for them as well. You need to show off your dairy, your animals. Calves are always a hit with those that are coming to the dairy, but make sure that you follow some health procedures with that as well if people are going to be allowed to touch the animals on your farm. Calves are always a hit with the kids, and the opportunity to feed a calf is always a highlight for someone visiting the farm. So, time to get started working on your story, what you would like to communicate about your dairy and about your dairy industry for those that might want to visit the farm. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to start looking forward to June and celebrate Dairy Month on your farm with your community.
Thanks, Mike. And while we have a moment, this reminder, Kansas State University's Department of Animal Sciences and Industry is opening its doors this summer to high school students interested in becoming leaders in the livestock industry and related careers. Department officials say that applications are now open for the Kansas State University Animal Science Leadership Academy, set for June 21st through the 24th in Manhattan. The Academy, co-sponsored by the Livestock and Meat Industry Council, is an intensive 4-day educational experience designed to enhance the leadership skills and animal science knowledge of students in grades 9 through 12. To ensure individualized attention from counselors, professors, and industry leaders, only 20 students will be accepted for the 2023 session. Applications are due April 15th and can be found online at asi.ksu.edu/KASLA. That's asi.ksu.edu/KASLA. A $50 fee is due upon acceptance. Additional costs are covered by the Livestock and Meat Industry Council. The program's itinerary for the 4 days features interactive workshops, tours, and faculty mentor time with K-State professors. Industry leaders will also share their knowledge and expertise. Throughout the week, participants will be working in teams to evaluate current events in the animal science industry, culminating in team presentations. Again, for more information, asi.ksu.edu/KASLA. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.